Well, welcome to this issue of Discovering Truth at the Movies. Hi, my name is David Lance. Well, today we're going to look at this episode of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar, in which Haman plots how to move forward with his plans to destroy Daniel and overthrow King Nebuchadnezzar following the debacle of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego surviving the fiery furnace. A letter from the prophet Jeremiah gives Haman some cover that he needs to lay his trap for Daniel and under the cover of pretending to honor the God of the Hebrews. Today, we'll look at the movie Mary Poppins Returns and examine a supposed friend who tried to cheat Michael Banks out of his inheritance for our question for reflection. I just want you to know that the book, The Chronicles of Belteshazzar, is now available for sale on Amazon.com. It's a novel about a boy who learned how Daniel lived by faith instead of cowering in fear. And so without further ado, let's look at chapter 18, Haman Makes His Plans. The red star in Orion's belt twinkled as a ruby in the clear night sky. As Haman looked out his window at the stars above, he savored the sense of elation which coursed through his veins. Nebuchadnezzar had heard and agreed to his plan, one which would acknowledge the events of the other evening, but which would position the Hebrew God as being wholly subservient to Marduk. And they owed it all to Daniel's teacher, this so-called prophet named Jeremiah. Neither Haman nor Nebuchadnezzar could allow the escape of the three Hebrews from the fiery furnace to go without explanation. And so Haman had devised a scheme which allowed Nebuchadnezzar to not only take credit for their survival, but claim that the king had himself been the agent of their escape from the furnace. Haman had written a decree which Nebuchadnezzar had signed and was now being distributed throughout the kingdom. For perhaps the 20th time, Haman again read the parchment containing the decree as he had drained his wine goblet. The prophet Jeremiah has written the exiles in Babylon, saying, "Build houses and settle down. Marry, have sons and daughters. Increase in numbers, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city of Babylon, praying to the Lord for it, because if Babylon prospers, you too will prosper. The God of Israel has appointed Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, as his servant to bring salvation to your people. He is the Messiah of the Hebrews." Yet some of the Hebrews had doubted the will of their God, and so Nebuchadnezzar put you to the test. Of all the Hebrews, only Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego passed that test, to trust in the God of Israel, who has sent you to Babylon to serve Nebuchadnezzar. Praise be to the God of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and did not worship the gods of the Babylonians. With the blessing of Marduk, their gods saved them from the fiery furnace, so that the Hebrews would honor his command to dwell in Babylon and serve her king. For now, for how else could the God of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego save them if it were not the will of Marduk? Therefore, because of their faithfulness, these three will be given positions of power in the kingdom of Babylon. Furthermore, the God of Israel will be given a place of honor with the gods of Babylon and sit at Marduk's right hand. From this day forward, to commemorate his inclusion into the house of the gods, his name shall be called Beelzebub. Haman laughed as he read this last line, for in the language of the Hebrews, the name Beelzebub meant Lord of the Flies. The effect would not be lost on his people, which both he and the king agreed was needed to restore their faith in the gods of Babylon after what had happened. Haman looked up again at the red star in Orion's belt. He knew there was no explanation for what had happened the other night. But rather than deny that it had happened, they would embrace it, claiming that it had been the will of Marduk all along, and that the God of the Hebrews would join the pantheon of Babylonian gods pledged to serve Marduk. As the people on earth were assimilated by their Chaldean masters, so too their God would be assimilated by the gods of this land. It was a simple solution to a complex problem. Haman heard the woman approach behind him, felt her wrap her arms around his chest. I grew tired of waiting for you to come back. Still thinking about your triumph from earlier today, eh, my lord? Timnah asked. Yes, Haman answered, still looking up at the stars. And what was best was Daniel's reaction to the whole good news. Haman savored the memory as he prepared to tell his mistress. We summoned the Hebrew after Naaman gave his report. Nebuchadnezzar announced that the God of the Hebrews would henceforth be called Beelzebub and added to the pantheon of idols to be celebrated in the future New Year's celebrations. Even now, the goldsmiths have been commissioned to form idols for purchase by the people, especially by the Hebrews living in Babylon. But why wouldn't Daniel see that as a good thing? Asked Timnah, slowly caressing the chief priest. Because they refuse to make idols of their God. In fact, their religion forbids it. Daniel has said many times that his God is the one true God. He realizes that by making his God one of the Babylonian pantheon, the religion of his people will be compromised. Not only that, but as the greater has the power to change the name of the lesser, Marduk is elevated over the God of the Hebrews, whose name is now Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies. In a generation, they will lose their distinctiveness and be of no trouble to anyone. And now that Daniel has been discredited before the eyes of the king, what do you intend to do? She asked, turning the man around to look into her eyes. Nebuchadnezzar fears the power of Daniel. He has appointed the Hebrew to a position of power and cannot undo that. But at a time of my choosing, he will take an action which will force Daniel to defy a royal command and thus forfeit his life. For now, that is all I can say, as I must take my leave. I have much to do today. Haman kissed her on the cheek and turned to leave. But as he did so, he resolved to be much less free with the information he shared with the queen of Ashkelon, for one question still ate at him. How had Daniel been forewarned of the plan to force the Hebrews to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar? Daniel's sudden appearance with an excuse to be out of the city during the New Year's celebration had been far too convenient. If Daniel had been alerted by someone, Timnah's name would lead a short list of suspects. He would have to satisfy his suspicions, and if it proved that she had betrayed him, take the steps necessary to ensure her future silence. And so, with that, I want to offer a personal reflection. You see, scholars believe that Jeremiah wrote his letter to the Hebrews living in Babylon sometime around the year 593 BC. You can find the story of that letter in Jeremiah chapter 29. It was also at about that time that scholars believe that the Babylonian forces attempting to overthrow Nebuchadnezzar began to put their plans into action. Another factor to consider can be found in Jeremiah 27, verse 3. There we learn that a League of Nations had come to meet in Jerusalem with King Zedekiah to attempt to get him to join them in their planned revolt against Babylon. Because of concerns over his loyalty, we are told in Jeremiah 51:59 that Zedekiah was summoned to Babylon to meet with King Nebuchadnezzar in about the year 593 BC. And so, in the mix of all of this, the details of the plot to destroy Daniel and overthrow King Nebuchadnezzar come into focus. I use the story of how Nebuchadnezzar's praises the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to justify the decree to build a temple to honor their God. This sets in motion the inclusion of an apocalyptic tale about the prophet Daniel called Bel and the Dragon, and the presence of a deep state within Nebuchadnezzar's government that seeks the overthrow of the king. For anyone who follows the news in modern times with regard to the John Durham investigation into the plot to smear President Trump with an accusation of collusion with the Russians, one can see that such palace intrigues have happened time and again in human history. What really happened during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, I can't say. But as I wrote the story, I wanted to bring these sorts of things out for young readers who might be interested in someday looking into the history of the exilic time period. The issue of people being duplicitous appears in many stories, and I think it lies at the heart of what was going on in the backstory of the book of Daniel. And as an example of people being something than what they pretend to be, take the 2018 movie Mary Poppins Returns. Michael and Jane Banks have now grown up, and Michael has his own children. The movie is set during the Great Depression, and Michael is going to lose his home unless he can come up with a way to pay off the bank loan. He goes to Mr. William Weatherall Wilkins, the bank president, to plead his case. Michael knows Mr. Wilkins is a friend of the family and so trusts him. Michael knows that he has shares in the bank and asks Mr. Wilkins for a record of his ownership of the shares. He hopes that he can use the money to pay off the bank loan. Wilkins looks through the documents with Michael present, but claims to find nothing relating to the bank's family. He assures Michael that he will continue to look, but after Michael and Jane Banks leave, he tears out the page with the bank's name on it and throws it into the fireplace. Only when his children get ready to fly a kite and discover the deed to the bank shares is on the back side of the kite does Michael realize that he has a way of proving his claim. Mr. Wilkins refuses to accept the bank certificate, claiming that Michael failed to produce the certificate before the clock struck midnight. Wilkins wanted to profit by claiming the bank certificate for himself, but the timely return of Mr. Dawes Jr., played by the actor Dick Van Dyke, leads to the firing of Mr. Wilkins and the financial rescue of Michael Banks and his family. Whether it is the conniving schemes of a banker in the movie Mary Poppins Returns, efforts to frame the President of the United States as being involved in a conspiracy with Russia, or the effort of political opponents of King Nebuchadnezzar to plot his overthrow, the potential for evil is a constant thread in the affairs of mankind. I hope this episode in the Chronicles of Belteshazzar has helped you find a way to explain that people cheat in great things and in small things. The key is to hold people to account and believe, as Mary Poppins said, when the world turns upside down, the best thing is to turn right along with it. And that leads us to this revealing conversation between Mr. Wilkins and Mr. Dawes. "What on earth are you doing here?" says Mr. Wilkins, and Mr. Dawes replies, "A little bird told me you've been trying to cheat the Banks family out of their bank shares." And so the question for reflection for us is, when you see others cheating, do you call them on it or do you remain silent? Well, I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Chronicles of Belteshazzar and Discovering Truth at the Movies. To learn more about my ebook series on Discovering Truth at the Movies, visit my website at www.wisejargon.com/@the-movies. And also be aware that you can order the book, The Chronicles of Belteshazzar, in paperback and the Kindle version on Amazon.com.